Goldberg his talk is Drilling Down on Immunotherapy in Colorectal Cancer. Rich.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. So we have participated in a number of the early studies, the Hopkins study in colorectal cancer, and I have to say that I have never witnessed the Lazarus effect before using pembrolizumab. And, I have one notable 26-year-old patient with Lynch syndrome who was a dancer who came in a wheelchair and is back to professional dancing. So those are the highlights of our lives as treating oncologists. These are real drugs with real efficacy. Now, just to remind you, in colorectal cancer, when you look at the two pathways through which colon cancer is felt to arise, there's a chromosomal instability pathway and the genetic instability pathway. So 85% of patients' tumors arise through chromosomal instability. Those are the microsatellite stable tumors, and about 15%, if you look at all stages of colon cancer, arise through the microsatellite instability pathway. And of course, the story is much more complicated than just that, as is illustrated by the other activating and inactivating mutations that you can see in this disease. But in general, I'm going to use a dichotomy between the MSI high and the MSS patients in my conversation. Now, this illustrates that the biomarker that we've all gotten so used to looking at, RAS, is actually more commonly seen in stage 4 disease than it is in stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3 disease. The opposite is true of microsatellite instability. And that's a very interesting observation, that those tumors tend to be better prognosis tumors and found at earlier stage. If you look at stage 4 disease here, which is the purple marker, it's only about 4% of patients with advanced colorectal cancer that have microsatellite instability, so it's a small minority of patients that will be involved. Now, one of the big questions is, do we have a biomarker that helps us know which patients will respond and which won't? Even among the microsatellite unstable patients, not all patients respond. And one of the questions is either the level of PD-1 or PD-L1 expression important in terms of making predictions about response? And the answer to that is, at the current time, it is unclear whether they're prognostic or predictive, and they're not clinically useful in colorectal cancer. Studies have come down on both sides of this, and when you look at item number 3 there, PD-1 is expressed about equally in MSS and MSI high tumors, and so it isn't a differentiating point, not useful at this time. Now, this is an illustration about the hypermutated state that is consistent with Lynch syndrome or acquired microsatellite instability. And when you look at liquid tumors like CML, which often has one mutation treatable by one drug that targets that mutation, you have a very small number of mutations, while in mismatch repair deficient tumors, regardless of whether they're in the colon or in other organs, there's an order of magnitude more mutations, an order of magnitude more mutated proteins, the potential for identification of those mutated proteins by the immune system, and therefore that is felt to explain a lot of what we're seeing. Now, it's interesting, back in the 1990s, Dan Sargent and Steve Gallinger and I did a bunch of work on looking at 5-FU benefit in adjuvant therapy in patients with mismatch repair high tumors. And many of you are probably aware that Dan Sargent, who was a childhood Hodgkin's survivor, passed away of what are probably late complications of cancer at the age of 46 recently. But I think that he was truly one of the geniuses that I've had an opportunity to interact with in my career. And here you see on the right, and I'm going to lean to the right first, which I'm afraid perhaps describes our political situation at the moment, and then I'm going to lean to the left. So on the right here, you'll see that if you take patients with stage 2 colon cancer that are untreated, The mismatch repair deficient patients in black have a much better prognosis than do the patients with proficient mismatch repair, 80% 5-year disease-free survival versus 56. If you treat those patients with mismatch repair deficient tumors with 5-FU, you take away that advantage. And Steve Gallinger, who's been a student of Lynch syndrome through his entire career, a surgeon from Canada, said, well, I think we're killing the wrong cells. We're killing the immune cells and allowing the cancer cells an advantage with the 5-FU, and I thought he was nuts. Maybe he wasn't. Here you see a meta-analysis, because there, as usual, there are studies on either side of this, but if you look at the randomized and the larger studies, there's really pretty consistent information that there's something that 5-FU does to mismatch repair high tumors that is not beneficial and is different than what it does for the chromosomal instability arising tumors. And that leads then to the thought that perhaps immune modulators would have an effect. And it seems like every time we look, there's a new immune modulator on the list. The three that are bolded here are the main ones I'm going to talk about. But as you know, there are intense interest in these immune modulators. And virtually every oncology company has forgotten cytotoxics and moved to immuno-oncology, something that I think may be good and maybe not so good. So this was the study that we participated in at Ohio State with Hopkins. It was interesting. It was funded by Swim Across America, and those swimmers must be really happy with the outcomes of their study, because this really has changed the way we think about colon cancer. And the hypothesis behind this was that mutated genes encode for proteins that are different than normal proteins and potentially recognizable by the immune system. While normal average tumors have dozens of mutations, those that have mismatch repair deficiency have thousands of mutations and potentially have the opportunity to enhance recognition by the immune system. In this study, we had 3 cohorts: colon cancer patients that were mismatch repair deficient, colon cancer patients that had tumors that were proficient, and then non-colorectal cancers. And I'm mainly going to focus on the colorectal cancers. Here you can see that the objective response rate for the mismatch repair deficient patients was not 100%, but it was 62%. And these were all heavily pretreated patients, so this was startling. But sadly, there were no responses in the 96% of patients with metastatic disease that have mismatch proficient tumors. And the disease control rate here was almost 100%. Not 100%, but almost 100%. And so this was one of those signals that you could not ignore. And here you see the spider plot. The red are the mismatch proficient tumors. They all kept growing. The green, the mismatch deficient colorectal tumors, most of which shrunk. And you also will note that the duration of response was long. Many of the patients that I started treating are now out at 2 years, and we're having to take them off study because the study only provided for 2 years of treatment while they're still responding with therapy. Here you can see the target lesions. Again, the red ones all above the line were the mismatch proficient patients. A few of the mismatch deficient patients didn't respond. A few of the mismatch proficient patients did have tumor shrinkage but didn't have enough to call it a response. But you can see quite a difference. And here you see the progression-free and overall survival curves, which were dramatically different. Different enough to get in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, initially when I started treating patients with this, I thought, these drugs don't have any toxicity. And then we learned. So I've gotten to be really good friends with our endocrinologists and our rheumatologists as a consequence of this. So I have patients who have hypophysitis and become panhypopig. I had somebody who didn't have diabetes who ended up in the ICU with DKA because his islet cells were the target of the immune system. We have people that are hyperparathyroid, hyperthyroid, all kinds of interesting endocrinologic disorders. And unfortunately, they don't seem to necessarily go away when you stop the drug or take a break from them. So what we learned from this study was amazing, that these mismatch repair deficient tumors are highly responsive to checkpoint blockade. That this clinical benefit was noted across tumor types, and the common marker was mismatch repair deficiency. That you saw biochemical responses with CEAs that were falling, sometimes despite the fact that tumors weren't shrinking or were actually enlarging. But those CEA responses tended to be useful markers of eventual response. And that these tumors are highly mutated, and so the theory was borne out in actual practice. Now, tomorrow, Mike Overman from MD Anderson will be updating this study, which you heard or saw at ASCO last year if you were there, looking at another PD-1 inhibitor, Nivo, given with the CTLA-4 inhibitor, IPI. This was a two-arm study, one Nivo alone, the other Nivo plus IPI. And you can see that there was about a 50% disease control rate, partial responses in stable disease with Nivo alone. And again, you see the spider plot that looks promising. If you look at the patients with Nivo on the left, Nivo and IPI on the right, you can see that there were actually more patients who got benefit on the Nivo plus IPI, about 80% of patients compared to 56% of patients on Nivo alone. And here you can see the Nivo plus IPI progression-free survival rate, which was a bit better than what was seen with the Nivo alone. And then here's the overall survival in the MSI high patients, which is remarkably long for this heavily pretreated subset of patients. You can see that in what is at least third-line therapy, 66% of patients were alive at 12 months on the Nivo arm, and that hadn't yet been determined on the Nivo plus IPI arm. Here you can see median overall survivals as noted. Now, those of you who've had the fun of managing patients who are getting IPI know that it has a potential for a significant amount of toxicity, and there was significantly more grade 3/4 toxicity giving 2 immunotherapy agents than there was giving 1. And in particular, fatigue, diarrhea, and nausea were more common. So Mike Overman's conclusions here were that Nivo monotherapy was active, that Nivo plus IPI was active and positively affected a higher number of patients, that the safety profile is tolerable, but again, these patients may get out to a couple of years and have more immune toxicity, and that these are encouraging results, and certainly there was a sense of optimism about them at ASCO. And then finally, I'm going to talk about this study that Joanna Bedell presented, looking at the Genentech Roche drugs, atezolizumab and cobimetinib. And you'll remember that atezolizumab is a PD-L1 antibody. The other 2 drugs I've talked about are PD-1 inhibitors. And I won't go through the mechanism of action because that's really been elucidated by Craig. Here you can see the rationale for using a MEK inhibitor in concert with a PD-L1 inhibitor, and in particular in the right-hand column you can note the red line, which is the MEK plus PD-L1 inhibitor, showing marked reductions in tumor volume. So this study focused on patients who didn't have microsatellite instability. And the hope was that we could figure out a way to induce this immune response by coupling drugs rather than doing monotherapy. And at least initially, it looks like this is a promising potential approach. As you can see that there was about a 20% response rate, again, heavily pretreated patients. Here you can see the common theme that these responses are often very durable and satisfying for both the patient and the person treated. And this then led to a phase 3 study that accrued so quickly that it was just several months before it enrolled almost 400 patients. So the study's done, and it's just maturing at this point. And hopefully we'll see if cobimetinib plus atezolizumab versus atezolizumab alone versus rego alone leads to different outcomes. So with regard to this particular study, this treatment was relatively well tolerated, mainly fatigue. There was a higher clinical response rate in the microsatellite stable patients than expected, particularly from PD-1 or PD-L1 inhibitors alone. Overall response rate of 17% and overall survival at 6 months of 72% in this heavily pretreated group of patients. And this suggests that you can use drugs to sensitize the immune system to PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. And this has led to a study that's being done in the NCTN, the National Cancer Treatment Network, led by the Alliance by Frank Sinecroke from Mayo Clinic. This is in stage 3 colon cancer. And it's going to look at those patients only with MSI-high tumors. We're going to require around 700 patients to do this. Again, this is only about 10 to 15% of patients with stage 3 disease, so we're going to have to screen a lot of patients in order to get this number of patients, and we probably will end up collaborating with colleagues in Europe who are also very interested in this study. Randomized study between standard of care FOLFOX6 and atezolizumab plus FOLFOX6. And then the other thing is that, as you may know, there are many studies being run in using PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitors. Keynote 177, I think there are more than 200 Keynote studies. This one is looking at coupling pembrolizumab with chemotherapy and with bevacizumab. We participated in a study of pembrolizumab plus FOLFOX, and my initial impression is, among the patients that I've treated, that it seems promising. I've seen dramatic, deep responses in some of the patients that I've treated. And then there is some potential data that VEGF inhibition can be synergistic with PD-1 inhibition. And so there's a phase 1 study of atezolizumab, bevacizumab, and FOLFOX also underway. So in conclusion, there are multiple PD-1 inhibitors out there. They all seem to have activity in MSI-high colorectal cancer. It looks like there may be a potential avenue for MSS patients, and it's uncertain yet whether chemotherapy is going to add to this, but I hope it will. Clearly, we're going to be talking about this for years to come, and that's good news. So with that, I'll close and be happy to answer questions.
Activity in the MSI-high sporadic colon cancer.
So the question was, is there any activity in the MSI-high sporadic colon cancers? So you remember that about 4% of colon cancers are associated with Lynch syndrome. The 11% of the MSI-high patients that are not Lynch syndrome patients have hypermethylation as a cause of their colon cancer. And all have hypermutated tumors, and so it appears that this strategy is active regardless of whether this is germline or acquired hypermutability. Other questions? Yes, please.
In melanoma study, when you have a high PD-L1, you can just give Nivo alone, but if you have low PD-L1, then Epi plus Nivo have better response. So I guess that in the Overman study, using that in colon cancer, can we have, that subset of this patient who will need combination therapy, so that way we can save some of the patient doesn't need to go to.
So I'm not sure I got your question completely, but I think what you're asking is, are PD-1 and PD-L1 levels prognostic or predictive in colon cancer like they are in melanoma? And the answer is there's no data to suggest that they are yet, but we're early on in understanding that.
If you have a patient, it's not unusual for MSI high colon cancer patients to be BRAF mutant.
Right.
And what can you comment on what route you might follow? There's studies for perhaps for both of them, each of those populations. What's your thoughts there?
Again, tomorrow there'll be data presented by Scott Kopacz looking at BRAF mutated colon cancers treated with a BRAF inhibitor as well as cetuximab plus irinotecan. That's going to show that the predicted activity really was found in the study. And so I think that opens another possibility, like the MEK inhibitor study, of using a BRAF inhibitor along with a PD-1 inhibitor for that subset of patients. Again, that's only about 8% of people with metastatic colorectal cancer, so it looks like as GI oncologists, we're going to be subsetting like lung cancer doctors in the future. It's not molecular determinants, and that's good news. Other questions? Yes, please.
For patients with MSI high, for example, we have now a new option, and it seems to be very interesting. But it is changing your practice. For example, a patient with MSI high, you choose the first line, the treatment with PD-L1, or you keep the chemotherapy in first line, or where is the right place, second line or third line, where's the right place to those patients?
Well, so it's interesting, there are studies looking at pembrolizumab alone versus chemotherapy in first line. And my hope is that those studies will be positive. My expectation is that those studies will be positive, but we don't have data on it yet. It's not uncommon for us to take things that we find in one setting and apply them to another place. But I think you do that now on the basis of enthusiasm rather than data.